Welcome, I'm Greg Kozak, Director of Sustainability at Northwestern University, and today's panel host. So thanks for joining today's panel discussion. It's focused on making the connection between voting and climate change, particularly in a critical election year like this. So today's panel was organized in coordination between sustainNU, the Center for Engineering, Sustainability and Resiliency at Northwestern, and then the Institute for Sustainability and Energy at Northwestern, or ISEN. So for our audience members, the intent of today's panel is really twofold. It's to educate attendees and promote greater awareness on one, how their vote can affect climate change and positively influence environmental progress, and two, why climate change is different in terms of elections and voting. And so before I turn things over to Abigail, who's our moderator today, I did have a few audience guidelines and information about today's panel format. So first, all participants, and we ask that you stay muted throughout the session. Second, today's panel will also be recorded for those who are unable to attend live, and we'll be posting that on the sustainNU website later today or tomorrow. And then finally, audience members are encouraged to participate in the chat box where you can share your thoughts, your hot takes, and your ask questions of our panelists. So to open that chat box, click on the chat button at the bottom that you can see here. Let's give it a shot, audience members. Let's see who I can pick on. No, I'm kidding, but please go ahead, say hello in the chat box and introduce yourself so we know who you are. We know you're here, and please pose great questions for our esteemed panel. So now that we've covered the basics, why don't we get started? We've got a tremendous group here today of NU professors across a broad range of schools and departments and expertise. So to introduce today's panel is our moderator, Associate Professor within Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, Abigail Foerstner. Abigail, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Greg, and welcome everyone. Almost all of us have directly confronted the high stakes of climate change and environmental disaster this year. More wildfires due to temperature rise and drought. More intense hurricanes due to warming oceans, and more flooding in the Midwest driven by record rains and record high lake levels. COVID-19 contagion and death is striking disproportionately among people of color in polluted industrial corridors of cities across the country and our city, a margin of a few miles to corridors of environmental injustice in our own community. About half of us agreed in a recent Yale climate survey that we are causing climate change. Yes, it's human activity. And 86%, a lot greater consensus in that same survey, agreed that they want climate policy support and funding for renewable energy resources. Policy and science funding that we're not getting right now. But voters are vastly more polarized than that by party on the priority they give to candidate commitments to climate change and the environment. You must vote to make the critical connection between elections and climate change action at all levels of government. Our panelists today cross many disciplines to offer such diverse perspectives on that connection, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. Keith Woodhouse is an associate professor of history and teaches courses for Northwestern's history department and the environmental policy and culture program. His research interests include environmental history, intellectual history, political history, and the US in the 20th century. He is the author of The Co-Centrists, A History of Radical Environmentalism. He is focused in that book on political and philosophical commitments that radical environmentalists held and what those commitments tell us about relationships between the environmental movement and American political thought. Nancy Loeb is a clinical professor of law at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law, and she's the founder and director of the Environmental Advocacy Center, the Environmental Advocacy Clinic. The clinic works with clients and partner organizations to protect the environment, promote clean energy and sustainability, and work for environmental justice in Chicago, the Midwest, and globally. Professor Loeb is a member of the board and a former board member of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Mark Werwath is a clinical professor in the Industrial Engineering and Management Sciences Department and executive director of the Office of Professional Education. His research focuses on innovation, diffusion, new product development, and lately on technical entrepreneurship. Mark has taught the Nuvention Energy course for more than 10 years and coached dozens of teams in commercializing clean technology in the marketplace, with many teams having launched their own clean tech businesses over the years. David Dana is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law and Director of the Program on Sustainability and Food and Animal Law at Northwestern's Foerstner School of Law. He has written extensively on climate policy and law issues, and he's consulted with a number of NGOs. Kimberly Marian Susay-Sia is an assistant professor in Northwestern's Political Science Department and the Environmental Policy and Culture Program. Susay trained as an interdisciplinary environmental social scientist. She specializes in global environmental policies and political ecology. Her book manuscript, The Justice Gap in Global Forest Governance, explores the politics of justice and representation in global forests and climate governance, and impacts on forest-dependent communities in Laos. She has extensive experience as a practitioner, including stints with the Peace Corps, with the Sierra Club and IUCN, and on World Bank-funded projects. Her publications have appeared in Global Environmental Politics, Conservation and Society, Forests, Environmental Politics, and Global Environmental Change. She's the lead PI for the Presence to Influence project that examines the politics and practices of Indigenous representation and justice pursuits in global environmental governance. Welcome to you all. And Keith, would you lead us off with a few opening remarks?
Sure, thank you, Abigail. Thanks everyone for attending. We're all going to make some brief opening remarks, and I'm actually going to focus my opening remarks on the presidential election, although obviously there are many other elections happening in November, state elections, local municipal ballot measures, etc. I'll focus mainly on the top of the ticket. And I'll just start by saying that I grew up as part of Generation X, which means that I grew up deeply cynical about politics. And I want to talk briefly about two versions of that cynicism that I think no longer apply, if they ever did. And the first is the criticism that every 4 years we're told that it's the most important election of our lifetime. And of course it can't possibly be, right, the most important election every time. And it's easy to assume that this sort of most important label is just a combination of hyperbole and political salesmanship. But if you're thinking about climate change, it's actually easy to understand elections in terms of accumulating urgency, greater and greater urgency every time. We're living in an era of partisan gridlock in which Congress is generally unable to pass major laws, and legislative inaction on climate change doesn't mean that nothing gets done. It means that the status quo remains in effect. And that's actually something getting done. It's just the wrong thing getting done. It means that greenhouse gas emissions are being steadily pumped into our atmosphere. So electing policymakers with no interest in addressing climate change doesn't simply mean that we have to wait several more years until we get another chance and a better crop of candidates. It means that we will endure several years in which our nation's policies and institutions are aggressively altering the planet in ways that will harm people and non-human nature. And those harms will fall disproportionately on those nations and people and beings who have the least power to protect themselves. The second kind of cynicism is the one that assumes that in a two-party system, both parties are basically different versions of the same thing, and there's really not that much daylight between them. And there may be some truth to that in some aspects of governance and policy. But environmental issues are one area in which the parties have had very different trajectories, especially over recent decades. Historians are still sort of figuring this story out and filling in some of the blanks, but the broad outlines are that we've moved from an era in which environmental regulation was largely a bipartisan issue, by which I mean the late 1960s and early 1970s, to one in which environmental issues are hyperpartisan, which is our present day in the last couple of decades. The very short version of the story is that in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Republican Party grew more and more opposed to federal regulation of the national economy, and increasingly distrustful of scientific expertise, at least when it comes to environmental issues. And that has meant that the two major parties' positions on environmental issues, and especially climate change, are not only different, but often miles apart. And that also means that when it comes to climate change, it really does matter which candidates win and which party is in power. So you can take it from a mostly reformed political cynic, elections matter, and this one more than ever.
Thanks, Keith. Nancy, please share some of your thoughts.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for participating in this incredibly important and I believe urgent issue. And I am from a time, unlike Professor Woodhouse, I am from a generation before we got letters. And so I've seen a few more elections. And in my life, especially from the perspective of climate change, this is the most consequential election. We are somewhat at a precipice now. Things are happening even more quickly than models expected them to happen. For example, the strength of the fires that hit in the West this year are hitting about 30 years earlier than was expected. And so we are really at a point where we need to do something, or there will be so many harms built into our system and into the environment that many, many people and the world overall, both human and non-human, will suffer. And this election is so consequential because of that, because of the timing. The one thing that I would want to add to what Professor Woodhouse said is that we are not just standing still right now. We are doing something far worse than standing still. We are moving in the wrong direction. Right now, if you look at the past 4 years, more than 100 regulations that govern how businesses can operate in the environmental sphere have been withdrawn, pulled back, so that today you can release more methane into the air than would have been allowed just a few months ago. Coal ash can be allowed to spill, which makes it more profitable to continue to burn coal. We have withdrawn from global agreements, the Paris Agreement, to work globally. We have an administration that is actively promoting the use of fossil fuels. Climate change, the effects on our environment, it is a cumulative effect. We don't get rid of it overnight once it's happened. So I do believe that this is truly, from an impact on the world, the most consequential election I have ever seen. And in everything you'll hear me say today, you will hear me say, please vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Truly, truly high stakes. Mark, would you share some of your thoughts and ideas with us?
Yeah, certainly. I'm from the engineering school, so we don't tend, at least I don't tend to spend too much time thinking about politics or how votes are accumulated or what the impact is. However, I mean, clearly this is 2020, and what we've been told for 4 years is that elections do matter and elections have consequences. And of course, in my mind, the last 4 years, we've been going in the wrong direction largely. You know, governments set policy, and those policies tend to incentivize behaviors, and those behaviors impact both corporate and consumer behaviors. And in the aggregate, that's what's causing greenhouse gas accumulation. And those behaviors have tremendous consequences, even as simple as what type of food we choose to eat, right? Or what type of vehicle we choose to drive, or how we heat our homes. If you just think about the subsidized industries in this country and the billions, literally billions of dollars being poured into industries that are destroying our own environment, right? It's outrageous that our tax dollars are being used to destroy our planet and to destroy our way of life. These industries include the fossil fuel industry, first and foremost, right? We subsidize companies to drill, we subsidize companies to distribute fossil fuels, and to make those same fossil fuels so cheap that we are incentivized to consume more. Think about that, right? We are incentivized to consume more because the prices are lower, whether it's gasoline, natural gas, or what have you. And the same is true with meat, right? The meat industry has been subsidized for years. And that same meat that we are incentivized to consume is what's actually helping destroy the planet, whether it's too much water, methane gas, or what have you that come from the very cattle that produce the meat. So electric utilities, right? We've been told how many times that we have, at best, an early 20th century electric grid that needs to be modernized, but we're rarely told why that is, right? Imagine a future that has a two-way grid that can actually allow producers of electricity to become the same as the consumers. The consumers and producers can now be one and the same, and we can interact with each other and reduce overall demand and reduce the amount of fossil fuel that's used to basically to generate the electricity. So it is easy to be cynical, I agree, and sometimes I'm sure I'm guilty of it myself. I mean, in a sense, why it's so important is we've got really in the extreme two populations, one that's in denial that climate change is even happening, and on the other extreme, perhaps the far left, who believes that it's too late, that perhaps climate change cannot be mitigated, at least not in any kind of reasonable way, and that we need to shift to adaptation. And of those two extremes, I'm probably closer to the latter. And I do believe that we still can make an impact on mitigating, but I also think we need a strong dialogue on adaptation, because in many ways, every day we wake up and you read the news or watch the news, whatever, however you consume it, you're seeing the results of our inability to adapt to what has become an ever-present problem that I think we have to at least embrace and understand. Where is it coming from and how do we adapt to it? So, by the way, I cover a lot of this in my Nuvention Energy class, so I'd like to plug that. I offer that every winter quarter, so if you want to explore how to commercialize technologies that can help address these issues, the course is offered by ISEN, and I'm sure Jeff Henderson and I can answer any questions about it.
Thank you so much, Mark, for those insights. David?
Well, thanks. I'm not going to mention what generation I'm in. Well, the first thing I wanted to say isn't just limited to climate. I think one of the issues that's on the ballot, people say, is democracy, and I think that's true. There's a question about the integrity of the voting system and about whether we can have reasonable elections and change policy in a democratic way. So in some sense, everything's on the ballot if that's up for grabs, including climate policy. So whatever, even if you don't care about climate policy, which you probably do since you're coming to this talk, an election that's about the integrity of the voting system should matter to everybody. The second point I wanted to make really kind of takes off of, I think, Keith and Nancy's point, which is one way to think about this election is that we've had a terrible climate policy for the last 4 years. It's been not even climate policy, it's just been kind of fossil fuel, frenzy, right? But if you think about it more broadly, it's really policy that is in deep denial or at least negation of caring about scientific indications about health and human welfare. So I think if you think about the poor response to COVID, if you think about the fact that toxic pollutants are now being kind of allowed to be released at greater amounts, the failure to look at other risk factors, as well as the failure to deal with climate change, what kind of unifies it is a refusal to honestly recognize science and kind of invest in it and take account of it, however you want to deal with the different economic and other trade-offs. And And I think that's clearer to me now than it was a few years ago, that it's not just the climate issue and kind of trying to put climate science to the side. And climate science is very complicated. It's really putting science altogether to the side and sort of just refusing even for clear facts to recognize them. And that's scary, even beyond how scary climate is. And then the other issue I kind of raised, which also goes some earlier points, is that for climate mitigation to work, but also for climate adaptation to work in a humane way on the international scale, we do need some global leadership and global cooperation. It can't really be in isolated buckets. And one of the things that we've also seen in the last 4 years is kind of a retreat from meaningful global participation by the United States in institutions, or even in dialogue, even putting aside the Paris Agreement. And I think that's going to be important, especially with adaptation, especially with debates about geoengineering and what we should do with as a planet altogether. And that's another issue that kind of also even goes beyond climate change. You know, what do we do about climate's effect on migration and how to deal with that in a humane way? So if you think that science-based law and policymaking matters, and if you think kind of global leadership and cooperation matters, and it's hard for me to think they don't, then this is a really pivotal election, which is why I find it so nerve-wracking. I think I'm happy when it's over, but I guess it depends on the result. So.
Thank you, David, for that global perspective. And Kimberly, take it from here. I know that you can add with your research to the global needs.
Great. Well, thank you all for this opportunity to join this panel. I wanted to begin first by recognizing the peoples of the Council of Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, along with the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations, who are the traditional caretakers and stewards of the lands upon which Northwestern University has been built. And as I prepared my remarks for today, I reflected upon the ways in which these lands, their histories, and their relationships reveal to us the critical importance of understanding and invigorating representation to advance the visions of the worlds we aspire to. So what do I mean by this? So for me, representation is about how things, how ideas, peoples are made visible. And in US politics, we make these things visible through a variety of means. So through public fora, through social movements, by engaging with our elected officials, through the media, participating in civil society, and through voting. Our system of representation, as also Gen X, very cynical of politics, right? Our system in the United States is imperfect, as are all systems in some way. Some people and relations are more visible in this system than others. Some climate impacts are more visible than others. And these different issues impact communities in really differential ways, some of which are more visible than others. And it's these disparities, these invisibilities, and their perpetuation that help maintain the social, ecological, and environmental injustice that climate change is really indicative of. So when, for example, the people who cross our campus every day are unaware of the legacies that make our university possible, or when people are unaware of how climate change manifests for others, the opportunities for representation of alternative worldviews can become more constrained. And so that leads to a narrowing of ideas that come into circulation, and that narrowing narrows the opportunities to solve complex problems. So like climate change, addressing the flaws in our systems of representation require that we act not because of how it might impact us individually, but because taking action can help create the spaces in which more voices, ideas, visions, and relations can become visible and valued. And so the question I think that we really must ask ourselves is, how do we take the political action to affect the things that we care about? How can we make things more visible, and how can we reshape power landscapes? So I wanted to leave with some these will come up more, I think, as the panel goes on. But in thinking about how you can make things more visible, the first is to educate yourself on the environmental and climate policies of your local, state, and national representatives. And the second is to vote. So voting is one way in which we generate momentum to create and recreate the spaces of representation. And you can also help get out the vote. And as a former grassroots organizer who I don't think slept for most of 2004. I can tell you that talking to people about voting really matters when you're trying to get out the environmental vote. So I have a few other ideas that I can bring up later, but I really wanted to bring up this idea of thinking about our votes as ways in which we can make things visible that matter to us. So thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. All right, well, you've all given us a lot to think about, and as we do think about moving in the right direction, about visibility, about taking action, we'd like you to address two umbrella questions, big picture questions, you might say, and they are these. And we'd appreciate it if each of you would answer them in your own way from your own perspective and areas of expertise. First question, why is climate change different in terms of elections and voting? And why is it urgent to address climate change as part of this election? Second question, why is voting vital to our high priority issues? And what comes next for climate change action? So that's a lot to tackle in 2 or 3 minutes, but David, take it from here.
David, you're on mute.
Okay. David, you're mute.
I'm sorry. I think climate is different in a sense than some other issues because, as has been referenced, it isn't an easily reversible phenomenon, right? I mean, climate is a cumulative phenomenon, depending on some gases like methane gas last extremely long. And so anything that's done now can only sort of start to roll back what can be done. And there's also, depending on your modeling, and it seems increasingly clear, tipping points where once you go past a certain place, it becomes even more difficult to kind of retread on the mitigation front. And even in terms of adaptation, I think time really matters because almost all of the modeling or thinking about climate effects in terms of human health and human welfare take off of this fact, which is when things go slow, when people have time, you can limit the harms, right? You can, if you have to, you can move populations. If you have to, you can kind of do things with engineering, you can do things with changing agriculture. But when things happen fast, it's very difficult to have adaptation that doesn't result in a huge loss of human life, human welfare, and culture. So because of the nature of climate change, there really is an urgency in moving now. And one of the difficulties of climate change is because it's so global and amorphous and continuous and hard to, and it's easy to see in some ways, right, the effects, but in some ways it's very hard to see. It can seem not urgent, but it is in fact very urgent. And that's a very difficult point, but I think it's important. And one of the things, going to Kimberly's point, is that's something that requires education sometimes to make this clear. People see in their daily lives losing income, or they may see in their daily lives worrying about COVID. They may not, even when there's natural weather, from extreme weather that's climate affected, not connect it to climate change. So education really matters for people to understand that urgency, because it's not necessarily something they're going to see just in the ordinary course in their daily lives. Because one of the things that's been most difficult about politics in the US on issues of climate, just climate, is that if you look at rank orderings of issues of priority among voters when they do polling, and this is actually across parties, climate isn't very high. It's usually relatively low on the list. Economy, healthcare, racial justice, all really important, right, and all connected, are higher. And so in the US in particular, one reason it's hard to get a lot of impact on climate politics, even in the Democratic Party, which is, I think, is open to it, is that it isn't the highest priority issue for a lot of people. And that, I think, is one of the things that education really matters for. In terms of what comes next in climate, I think that, and this also takes off of something Kimberly suggested, is that, and also Mark, that it matters a lot to think about adaptation. So one of the big challenges is, how do we move away from a carbon-based economy? How do we encourage alternative technologies? And some of that's happening, and there's a much more that could be done. But there's also a lot that has to be done in terms of research and thinking about how do we protect coastlines knowing that there's going to be some erosion? How do we do that in an ecologically sensitive way? How do we protect, have development patterns that make sense given that there's going to be greater stressors on forest systems? And all of that can only really be debated once policymakers and politicians can openly say it's a problem and connect it to the underlying phenomenon and really kind of embrace it. So it goes back to my first point, which is there has to be at least an open acceptance of science. And then you can debate what to do about it. But that, I think, has to happen first. And again, that's kind of what's on the table now politically.
Thank you. Keith, what do you think?
Well, so as David sort of gestured towards, climate change is what political theorists call a wicked problem because it's just so complicated and we can't really discern the edges of it and the dynamics. So it's a problem that has to be addressed through every possible means, certainly voting is the beginning of that process, but it can't be the end of it. In the United States, we tend to think about major policy shifts or major policy packages as coming through the federal government. There are obvious roadblocks to that happening for climate change. As I mentioned earlier, Congress is gridlocked. The filibuster is also a major obstacle to any sort of sweeping legislation. There have been key moments of policy shifts. Obama's Clean Power Plan from his second term was one of them, but that plan was carried out entirely through executive action. This is one of the sort of, without getting too much into the weeds, this is one of the dynamics of climate policy these days, is that it doesn't generally happen through legislation. Through Congress, it happens through the executive branch and presidential action. That can be significant, as the Clean Power Plan was. It was a big step in the right direction, but anything that one president can do through executive action, another president can undo, and that's what has happened under the Trump administration, is the Clean Power Plan has been undone. Even statutory regulation passed by Congress is at risk under a hostile administration. So in the last few months, we've seen the Trump administration attack the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is often referred to as the Magna Carta of environmental law, and that has been gutted through executive rulemaking. Now, there's multiple lawsuits, and we'll see how long those rule changes last, but a court has allowed those rules to stand for now, so that law has been severely weakened. So the federal government is crucial, but it's certainly not the only or maybe even the primary lever that we have. State governments may become leaders in this arena. California has probably been the most significant state in this regard. Governor Newsom has recently put forward through his own executive action plan to essentially get rid of the internal combustion engine in California by 2035. New Jersey is starting to take steps in that direction. So states can be leaders where the federal government is not. Municipal governments are important. Sometimes cities can achieve sort of political uniformity to a degree that larger polities cannot, and can be testing grounds for more purposeful policies. But one thing that we do know, and this is sort of getting to what happens after voting question, is that in the United States, we never have major political progress without pressure from below, right? That's the key ingredient. So you can never rely on policymakers alone. You can never rely on senators, certainly, presidential administrations, state governments, without grassroots activism. That's really the engine that drives political change in the United States. So, voting sets up the conditions in which policy change can occur. But the engine of that change is always going to be political pressure from citizens, from regular citizens, and grassroots activism. So that's why November 3rd will hopefully be the first step, or one of the first steps, but only that. It's going to require a lot more activism after that.
Thank you, Keith. Kimberly, please share some of your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. So yes, I was going to build off of what Keith said about the wicked problem and tell you that this is a super wicked problem, right? So, and that means climate change time is running out, and we know this. Another one of the challenges is that there is no centralized authority that can address this problem. So even if the US government were to take extreme action, we still need to bring along the rest of the world, right, in addressing this problem. And finally, political scientists Kelly Levin and Ben Kishore say that the people causing the problem are the ones trying to solve it, which means that it makes it really hard to solve because they're defining the problem, and they can define it in ways that make it that make solving part of the problem easy, but perhaps the breadth of the problem much more difficult. And so in terms of thinking about why we might vote for the environment and vote for climate change, I think it's sort of like a keystone issue that relates to all of the various problems that society is facing, right? The threats to democracy, not just in the US, but around the world. Poverty, right? Our health, water availability and access. And climate change intimately impacts all of these issues. And so in order to address them, we really need to mobilize collective action. And what we've seen internationally is that following the trend in the US, right, in the 60s and 70s, that there was a lot of momentum on the international stage to address climate change. And the United States was a real leader in the 70s, right, in getting some of our international environmental treaties into place. And we have since really retreated because of current sovereignty concerns, right? The US doesn't really want other countries to be able to infringe on our sovereignty. And so we've retreated, and international treaties, a lot of the language, and we saw this in the Paris Agreement, shifted from language around common but differentiated responsibilities to common but differentiated responsibilities according to your respective capabilities. And so it's a further sort of watering down of the obligation that we all hold to one another and to this planet to take action. And so I think that if we think about voting for the environment, we can, I do think this is, I mean, it's one step, and it's not that, it's only, as Keith said, the first step, but it's really important in trying to push for greater environmental leadership of the United States in the international space. And if only we care about how we're in competition with other nations, we're losing this, right? We are losing the climate battle. Other countries like China have really ramped up green energy production in ways that we could do here as well. We choose not to. And so I think, you know, I said what you should do after you vote is to thank your elected representatives who do consistently vote or represent to advance progress towards environmental goals. And I think you can also encourage your other elected representatives to do better. And then you can write letters to the editor, get involved in your local environmental board. Like here in Evanston, we have an environment board. We have an environmental justice mandate in the city of Evanston. And so I think there are lots of ways in which we could think about how do we create space for deeper and broader representation and deliberation, and that should be sort of the force by which we engage in our daily lives. How do we create relationships that move us forward instead of continuing to fight old fights that we're not able to unstick ourselves from?
Very good, thank you. Nancy?
Well, it's wonderful to hear the thoughts of other people on this. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction, but trying to put climate change for a moment into this time in the United States. One of the things that we're seeing right now is a reaction against injustices and a gathering of people together to fight injustices. And when we talk about climate change, it is and will be one of the great environmental injustices of our time. And yes, there are some very wealthy people whose homes are burning, but overall, across the world and within the United States, the people who are most endangered by climate change are the people who are endangered every day because of poverty and living in low-lying areas that flood, and are most in areas where droughts are already occurring. And so people from Central America are all leaving their homes, not because they think there are so much better places. They want to give up their culture. They want to give up their lives. They need to survive. And we are already seeing this. And more what we will see happening as a result of climate change is a growing injustice and an even greater disparity in wealth and ability to deal with these problems. And in many ways, even the people who are least caring about other people at this time should be concerned, because people are going to move as a result of climate change. They're going to have no choice. If you can't grow food in one place, if you can't feed your family, shelter them, then you will move to someplace else. And so one of the things that I think we need to communicate to the world, to people who have decided not to care, is we are all in this together. No one really gets to escape this. And I think we in the United States, especially during a time when there is a broadening among many people, not all, of a sense that we must address some of the injustices in our society, that we help people to understand that this is a huge injustice, environmental injustices generally, and climate as well, and try to encourage people who are willing to fight to create a more just society, to understand the importance of climate in that context as well. And there again, I can't not say this at any time I speak during this program. There are huge disparities in the way that people see these issues. And as Keith and others and Kim have explained, governments control much of what happens. We can try to force governments to act in certain ways from below, but if we don't change what a government is and how they are told to act through voting, things don't change. And we are very much at a time when there isn't a lot of time. I completely agree with Mark that adaptation is critical. Again, from an adaptation perspective, the people who are already worst off are the ones who are going to need assistance with adaptation most and the soonest. So again, just very, very time critical. And what we can all do in the next 2 weeks is vote ourselves and encourage everyone else, speak to everyone about the urgency of this so that everyone else gets engaged and votes.
Thank you, Nancy. Mark, take it from there.
I think one thing we haven't talked too much about is the overall anti-science movement that has been permeating the political landscape, whether it's subtle or not. A lot of people perceive the urgent risks that surround us in every direction and every way. And it's easy to point to the technocrats and to the scientists who supposedly got us here as potentially, you know, the root cause for why we have so much drama in our lives. And I mean, it's a disinformation campaign in many ways. It's very well thought through. And frankly, it leaves us with little choice if we abandon science. But let me really answer the two questions of why is this different and why is this urgent, right? So it's different because I think with climate change, it's difficult to connect dots. Human beings have a hard time connecting dots that are disparate. For example, food insecurity, right? How is that connected to climate? And then how does that create climate refugees? And then how and does that also create political instability? And we're seeing that in places like Syria, where it's been going on for years, but most people don't make those connections that are, you know, maybe not so obvious, right? These are long-term problems that move slowly until they don't, right? And right now they're not moving slowly, but up till now they have been. And it's very hard for human beings to kind of perceive these long-term, slowly evolving issues, right? That have huge, huge impacts. In fact, so huge that it's very hard for the human imagination to think of human beings impacting something as great as the environment, as large scale as the environment or the atmosphere at large, right? The solutions themselves are not well defined, right? I mean, I can change out my light bulb and I can get all my friends to do the same. We can even all drive Priuses or hybrid cars, but we all know that that's not going to, in and of themselves, they're not going to make much impact. In fact, most of my friends have done these things, and you can see the impact has been negligible, right? There's many special interests involved here that we are opposing, whether we know it or not, right? Large industries that employ large numbers of people. It's pretty clear to me that most people that I know are willing to engage in dangerous and risky industries if it fills their pocketbook in some way, form, or fashion, whether it's a paycheck or whether it's a dividend check, right? Either way, they're benefiting from the very thing that's destroying us, right? So in many ways, I think these are kind of the reasons why I think this is a different kind of issue, substantially, right, than say the other issues that confront us, whether it's injustice in the courts or injustice in the jails or what have you. I would point out that solutions look so far like different flavors of the problem that we're trying to solve. So we've already seen where natural gas has been positioned as a solution, even though it emits greenhouse gas, right? Clean coal, even though it's an oxymoron, it actually doesn't exist, but it's been positioned as a solution when it's actually part of the problem. Fracking, an even bigger part of the problem, again, positioned as a solution. And then lastly, biomass, right? Where we take trees and we turn them into fuel, which is what we used to do 200 years ago. So those are all part of the why different argument, the why urgent, right? I don't think we have that many more elections left before these inflection points start hitting us. If you imagine the exponential curve, what you do towards the end of that exponential curve is far more impactful than what you do at the beginning, because frankly, what we have right now is geometric growth, and the behavior changes of 7 or 8 billion people can have a huge impact, much, much larger than the behavior changes of 1 or 2 billion people from, a few hundred years ago. So that's my argument for why it's urgent. If not this election, when?
Okay, good point. All right, we have some time now for questions from our audience, and here is a provocative one. Recently, there's been a lot of additional attention on how the electoral system impacts this year's vote, particularly around climate change issues, given the location of swing states. And unlike the West Coast, the populations in some of these areas have not experienced the same level of climate impacts or climate disruptions. So anyone want to tackle that? How do we bring climate change home to the country overall? Mark?
I would say send them a bill. I'm sorry, we're paying the bills now, right?
Yeah,
so whether I live in Chicago, I live in a very safe, moderated climate where I don't have the fires on the West Coast, I don't have the hurricanes on the south or eastern coasts. So in the sense, you could say, well, why should I pay for it? Well, guess what? I mean, we pay for flood insurance, don't we?
Yeah.
Right, and that's impacting everybody, whether it's federal flood insurance or whether it's the reinsurances. I mean, pretty soon there's going to be parts of this country that are uninsurable, and frankly will have to be abandoned. And we're going to be talking about abandoned cities and abandoned counties. If we aren't, we should be, right, in the days, weeks, and months ahead.
I think there also are regional impacts that people can be educated about. I mean, Lake Michigan is under stress for a lot of reasons, but one of the stress is climate change. Agricultural outputs, depending on where you are in the Midwest, also might be affected. So it's not as if I mean, it's true, we don't face the, California seems to be having a big problems, right? I can't even say that word today. But there are predicted to be and already evident problems that are going to affect the Midwest as well. And also, it's an interconnected economy. Not only do we support government programs, that get charged to the Midwest or other states, but the economics of the country is all intertwined. So I think that needs to be stressed. The other thing, though, that's troubling is it's not obvious being near extreme weather actually makes you more concerned about climate change. I mean, Louisiana has terrible effects from environmental degradation and climate change, but partisan and other affiliations really sort of cut in different ways, and you don't have a strong support for climate change. So I think the nearness of effects maybe can matter, but education and political understanding, I think, actually matters more.
Yeah, thank you, David. Nancy?
I would just add to one thing that David said just now, is that Louisiana is a good place to look because their economy has developed in a way that's very much dependent on fossil fuels and things that are extremely harmful to the environment. But there is a disconnect between who profits from that and who pays the price in terms of the effects. The people who are profiting are not living in the low-lying areas. They are not typically the low-income communities of color that are suffering most from this flooding. And so there is, even within states, there is this disconnect, and finding a way that, as Mark says, we all have to pay in a way that equalizes that in order for people to change behaviors. There are some people who may be thinking that they're living 60 stories up in a well-protected building, and so why should they care? And so part of what we need to do is really help people understand the extent to which it is all interconnected.
Can Abigail, can I add something? So our electoral system, I think, was part of this question, and thinking about how different states are given more weight. One vote in Ohio means more than one vote in Illinois, for example, right? And this is legacies of partisan gerrymandering that both parties have engaged in, right, over the course of the history of our country. And I think this is why it's really important to vote, because we can change, right, the ways in which the electoral college works. So Maine changed their system in the last decade, whereby they do not give all their electoral college votes to it's not a winner take all state anymore. It's they divide up the votes based on the districts, right? And so there are also some economists and mathematicians have developed systems that show how you can make sure that one vote equals one vote for everyone everywhere in the United States if you do redistricting using some different mathematical algorithms. And so I think that we focus a lot on national level elections, but a lot of these decisions around how we assign our electoral college votes are done at the state level. And so this is why really attending to how your states are handling these systems and how the state houses decide how to run their elections in for their constituents, these matter immensely. And I think we're at a point of we can move. And I think the pandemic has really revealed this in a couple ways. We can move in a really progressive direction now and really think about what are the opportunities for change here and how do we harness the change that reflects the world that we want to see. Or we can further dig into the system that we have. And if we choose that path, well, we kind of know what our future will be. We don't know, right, what will hold if we go in a more progressive sort of, and by progressive I mean change, direction. So I think the electoral system is a very flawed system for electing the president in particular, but it's what we have, and we can't change it if we don't start focusing on who makes those decisions around how those votes are allocated.
All right. Any other questions that our audience might like to pose? I think we have time for maybe one more.
So Abigail, this one came through. It's a little long, so I'll try and distill it a little bit, but it's around conquering the political gridlock that has prevented effective U.S. climate change policy, and will require turnaround in the views of conservative leadership, so the people that vote with their tribe. And so it's hard to believe that most educated Republicans don't understand the science. So doesn't this suggest that the leadership on the right is banking on buying their way out of climate change, and whatever happens with everybody else is who cares? So do panel members think we can make progress while the sort of naysayers are still in power? I hope I captured that.
Yeah. Another big question.
Yeah.
Panelists?
We have 2 minutes left. Go.
Go.
Probably not. I mean, it's hard. Yeah, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, I sort of agree with probably not, but I think there are some opportunities for coalitions. So for example, you see in some conservative states, a willingness to invest in adaptation or even in renewable energy, as long as you don't label it climate change. So
Exactly.
there's some opportunities to do that in some segues. But under the current political administration, at least at the federal level, I agree with the probably not answer.
And I think, I think that what's going to change the Republican leadership is when it just becomes too electorally costly to oppose climate change related policies. And that hasn't happened yet, but I think we're actually not far from that point. I mean, climate denial used to be sort of the major opposition to effective climate change policies. And I think that's largely a thing of the past. I mean, there are still such a thing as climate denialists, but for the most part, right, we're at a point where nobody really denies that climate change is occurring. It's a question of sort of where is it coming from, what are the results, et cetera. So the dynamics are changing. I think there are actually major constituencies of the Republican Party that are potentially on the cusp of caring deeply about this issue. Rural America farmers, I think, are some of the people who are starting to really care deeply about how climate change is affecting their industry and are going to start voting that way eventually. The military, has been concerned with climate change for many, many years now. So I think that there are major parts of the Republican Party's constituency that are maybe on the verge of really caring deeply and voting according to this issue. The Republican Party, as Kim suggested, is already essentially a minority party that's banking on the dynamics of the Electoral College. So at some point, I think it's going to be untenable. But it's a question of when and how long that's going to take, and at what stage we'll be at then.
I think the other bit of good news, if there is any, is that the techno-economics are starting to support real change, whether it's techno-economics of wind and solar, which has achieved, and it actually achieved grid parity years ago, which means that it's actually more cost effective to put in more solar and more wind than it is to put in any kind of fossil fuel plant. And in many ways, these Republican constituents here are going to vote with their dollars and pocketbook in many ways, and the things that are more cost effective will generally prevail. And we're going to see that with EVs very soon, where EVs are going to be more cost effective to own and operate than a traditional ICE vehicle. So I think there is some good news. The question is whether it's enough and whether it's soon enough.
And your idea of a two-way grid, Mark, that's a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, I wish it was my idea. It's a much bigger idea than any one person I think could even take.
Right,
But
right, of course.
the whole idea is gaining ground, and especially in places like Japan and Australia, it's actually being implemented. Right?
Well, thank you to all our panelists for equating caring and voting, and also for the ways forward. Don't stop there. Don't stop at the voting booth. Move on. There's so much work to be done in terms of justice issues and the fight for environmental justice and adaptation and all the other things we discussed. So thank you so much. A lot to do. And Greg, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Just that brings us to the end of the panel. Again, thank you so much to our panelists and our moderator. We should have made this panel an hour and a half and not just an hour, but truly appreciate your perspectives and thought-provoking comments. Hopefully this has been educational for our audience members, and you know, just remember, don't trust polls, just vote. Right?
Vote.
So again, Greg Kozak, Director of Sustainability at Northwestern, and thanks again for joining us today, and take care.